So let's jump in and talk a little bit about MDS. So one of the goals of this project was an open source way that you can have a Mac on site to help you deploy Macs. Basically, what Deploy Studio used to be, and then the world kind of changed around us, and so we now have MDS to kind of help us deploy Macs. So we're on MDS 3 now. It's gone through a lot of different changes. The name has started off as Mac Deploy Stick, and it changed to MDS because it no longer really encapsulated it. And so this latest release, we rebranded it as Mac Deploy Server. So the idea is that it went from being something that's like you plug into your Mac that helps set it up to something that gives workflows and all the server resources, as well as an IoT device or a little automaton to be able to help automate the setup process of your Macs. So what is MDS? So MDS is a way to use all of the kind of Apple expected ways to be able to deploy the Mac, but do in a way that is kind of familiar to a lot of folks. So it's workflow-based initial deployments with automation. So the idea is that if you're setting up 100 or 5,000 Macs and you want to be able to do it as quickly as possible using kind of the methodology that Apple recommends, which is using the macOS installer, that it'll help you automate that process. And the way we make that minimize the time is not by making the installer faster. I wish there was a crank I could turn to make the installer go faster, but it really is the amount of time that the tech spends in front of the Mac. So if they can only spend a few seconds in front of each Mac and move on to the next one, by the time you get to the end, you just leave them sit. Half an hour later, everything's set up. So the idea is that you can optimize the amount of touch that you touch on a machine. It does include all the key things that are being required. It has an open source MDM, which is based on what includes MicroMDM. It has inventory, which is we added an MDS 3 that's Monkey Report, and it does not just inventory, it does a whole lot more. So it literally gets you to know what your fleet looks like. And then since MDS initially, I believe we had a way to configure Monkey. But we now build in a really easy way to make it as kind of a deployment of a server. And these are not, each of these pieces aren't required to use the one that's in MDS. If you already have a Monkey installation, you already have a Monkey report, you can still use workflows, still use the MDM. They're all interchangeable. What we really want to do is make a one-touch way to set up each one of these different services. So really think it's like macOS 10 server. No, I can't say anymore. Mac OS server, Mac OS 11, Mac OS, OS Mac server, but open source with a similar UI and kind of the similar focus. So the main key advantage that MDS has is workflows. The workflows allow you to automate the setting up of the Mac. So the whole philosophy behind it is that you walk up to a Mac, you do some activity on it, and whether it's unboxing, putting the inventory tag on it, or just getting it plugged in, and then once you boot it up, then you can walk away and go on to the next one. And 30 minutes later, after the installer runs through, you have a fully configured Mac. You don't have to touch it again; it'll be ready to go. That's the goal. And in certain environments, that works great. Other environments where you do user improve MDM, you may have to touch it once or twice more, but that's at the very end. You don't have to nurse it along and keep track of the state. So the idea is that it's like it minimizes the amount of stuff that you have to touch. And so why, in this new world of Macs, why do you need MDS if you can't just give money to Jamf to be able to do it, or Mosel, right? And MDM is really the key way to do it. And then with DEP to allow that bootstrapping of configuration, it's one of the ideas that it's kind of it's the optimal way to do it. But there is very much a cadre of customers out there, or folks out there that want to that don't have their Macs enrolled in DEP yet, or maybe they're enrolled and it's showing up the wrong account, or there's some issues with it, motherboards are replaced or whatever. Or we have lots of folks that are using it for like rental places that don't really fit into that model for DEP or MDM. NetBoot is dead. So using the old way to do it, where you just walk up to a machine and hold the N key down and bask in the glow of the lights on your switches lighting up, is dead. And so we need an alternate way to do that. And so getting the Mac up and booted and running in a way that we can configure it is not how we had before. So you could either net boot, target disk mode, or external boot. And so the net boot is basically the new hardware with T2 machines is dead. It doesn't support it. And external booting requires going into recovery and then enable external booting, then booting to the external drive. Then when you're done, booting back to recovery and re-enabling the protections for external booting. So that does require an extra step. So that's kind of difficult to do. That's another challenge people had, because they used to just have an external drive and they boot from it, and that's like the Play Studio remote version, or that allows you to have an external drive, or Play Studio external or something like that. So also is that if an MDM can't contact, or if the Mac can't contact an MDM, do you want to spend time troubleshooting it and figuring out, or do you just want to blast a new image onto it or blast a new configuration onto it and know that it'll be up and running? So the whole thing is that you want a consistent, fast way to set it up, so you know that you can roll through these and not take a long time. So that's what our goal was for MDS, to prepare Mac in seconds, use the standard macOS installer for latest firmware updates. We do support using ASR, the old kind of monolithic images that we don't recommend that in all situations. It really is a very specific situation where you're just putting the same OS back onto it. The macOS installer does a lot for you, and my understanding, my guess is on the new ARM-based Macs will even more so require the macOS installer to be able to use it, because there's a lot of logic built into that. Another advantage of having MDS is all the resources are local. So if you use an MDM, you enroll an MDM and have it use the daemon to go ahead and install the applications, those can trickle down over time, or they could time out, and it will be refreshed later, which is good, but it doesn't, you don't know that machine's set up when it's done, or it can take a long time. So what MDS does is it keeps all those resources local, whether it's on an external drive that's plugged into the Mac, or it's on a local web server. So, it can pull those, and it's package-based install. So the workflow fails, it means it's not installed. If it succeeds, it means it's success. So the machine that you're delivering is fully set up and ready to go. And we can fully automate this, or we can partially automate this. And that's, the partially automated isn't necessarily a downside, but rather sometimes you want to be interrupted. And so if you want to set the computer name, and a very common workflow is that the computer name is based on the asset tag, and that's not known ahead of time. That's the tech puts it on ahead of time and then has to type it in. So our workflow, when you run the workflow, it can prompt you not just for the computer name, but any arbitrary types of information that you'll use later for the configuration. So you can interrupt the process at the very beginning. It'll be partially automated, but it allows them to prompt for those users. So the way that it works is that you have a new Mac, or one that you want to, what we call rapid return to service. You want to get, put the OS back on, have everything set up correctly. And we leverage the boot part, we boot to the recovery partition. All modern Macs, or all Macs recently, have a recovery partition. And if you don't have a recovery partition, that's fine too. You can boot to internet recovery, which takes a little bit longer, but it puts you in the same environment. And once you've booted to this recovery partition, whether it's internet recovery or the standard recovery partition, then you kick off the workflow, which is just a script that's available either hosted on a web server or on an external drive. And that will bring up the workflow selector. And the workflow selector is based on Imager, which is an open source project from the NetBoot days. We've repurposed it to run these workflows that we create in MDS, and then it installs packages, installs profiles. At least in the meantime, that's going to change a bit in Big Sur, and also so I say profiles, packages, applications, and scripts. So you can just drop those in and be able to run them. So you can automate this whole process to have the Mac set up in a very specific state. So this, as I mentioned, the resources can be on an external drive, or they can be on a web server. So what you do is you mount a hosted disk image, and that's mounted, and you can run the resources from there. We were initially started off with external drive. It became so popular to do it over a web or an SMB server, we built in the ability to share images right built into MDS. And in MDS3, we made them in the background, so it's more of like a server type product. You can see here the workflow is selectors running, and it gives some logging output so you can monitor it. We also support remote logging and a lot of bells and whistles to kind of keep track of all those pieces. So as you as I mentioned before, if you follow this process I've outlined so far, you would take out this new Mac, put the property tag on it, and you would boot it up. You hold down you boot to recovery, so you'd hold Command R down. Then when you get into recovery, you would open up the terminal and launch the script. And if the script's located on the external drive, that's fine. If it's milking a web server, you're going to mount that disk image. So that means the tech has to do a few commands and wait for the recovery to boot up, which can take anywhere from, I think, 30 seconds to a minute and a half, right? So we want to cut that down. Plus, having somebody mount a disk image and open up terminal, mount a disk image and run a script, or just run a script, means they have to type stuff on the keyboard, which can slow them down and requires some knowledge ahead of time. So we came up with this idea of an automaton, which is a Arduino itsy bitsy from Adafruit. It's open source hardware. It's not made by us. It's made by Adafruit, but we provide the firmware that goes on it, which again is open source. It can be flashed on it. So you can go out and buy a $10 itsy bitsy from Adafruit. Make sure you get the 5-volt version because that's what our firmware supports. And inside the MDS app, flash the correct firmware on it. And what this does is it acts like a little robot inside that does those keys for you. So it knows how to hold Command R down. It knows how to open up terminal. It knows how to run the commands to mount the disk image and run the workflow. And it even knows about other things like if you don't have a Bluetooth keyboard plugged in, or if the language selector comes up, it knows how to dismiss those. And the way it does is it presents itself as an external keyboard. So it really is just going through the keyboard steps to be able to automate that. And you can customize that behavior inside the MDS app. So the idea is that now, instead of holding Command R, booting to recovery, opening up terminal, running a command, you now hold down the Option key, you see the boot selector, then you plug in the automaton. Walk away, you're done. It does automation from that point onwards. And it holds down the Command R key to boot into recovery. It opens up terminal, it runs the commands. And at that point, the workflows run, reboots, and you're done. So the nice thing about the automaton is that it'll automate all those processes, and it only needs to be plugged in until it's done running the commands. Then you can unplug it and move on. So the timing is important because we want to get this down as fast as possible. We can't make the installer go any faster, but what we can do is minimize the amount of time that you're in front of a Mac. So if you imagine you pull up the Mac, you hold down the Option key, you hear it chime. Well, you didn't used to hear it chime, now you hear it chime. Hold down the Option key, and then you see basically it says Macintosh hard drive. That's your key to plug in the automaton, and the external drive, if that's where your resources are. If you're using network, you can plug in an Ethernet dongle. This is a Mac Mini that has one already, but just plug in all the stuff you need, and then you'll see it start booting. You'll see the Apple logos that start booting to recovery. So then you move on to the next one, and then you move on to the next one. You move on to the next one, and by the time you get to the fifth one, right about the fifth time, the first one's done. It reboots. You can see the workflow ran. It reboots. You got the Apple logo with the progress indicator for installing the software. Then you can unplug the drive, unplug the automaton, and go to the sixth machine and keep going on. And so you just roll through these and not worrying about keeping state, because all you need to do is that if it's installing, you can unplug it. If it's not done if it's not showing, if it's still in recovery, you leave it alone. So that's basically the process you go through to get running. So this is the new UI, the new workflows to be able to provide a workflow. So very similar to what we had in Deploy Studio. We provide a workflow name and a description. This is presented to the technician once they're running the workflows in the recovery. The Mac OS version, you can specify a local installer. We also can specify an installer on a disk image URL. So that means if the workflow's up, if the Mac OS updates, but you want to update the workflow, like when 10.15.5 or 10.56 is released, you just update that disk image URL, disk image in that URL. Get an erase and install. And this bottom section, or the middle section here, erase volume and restore Mac OS from disk image, that allows you to, if you created a source from Insta or from AutoDMG that allows you to do ASR imaging, you can specify that as well. and you can put that one off on a web server as well. The last option is really fascinating because if you have a new machine that has the correct OS on it, or you want to do the updates later, so maybe it has 10.15.5 on it, and it's fine. All you want to do is install packages and enroll in MDM and those kind of things. This will, you can say, do not install macOS, and it basically won't even go through the macOS installer. It'll just install the packages and reboot and start running and start installing all the packages, scripts, and profiles. So the resources, there's 3 buckets you can do. There's packages and apps, and so these are just folders. So the packages and apps folder is some folder located on your desktop, and you don't have to put well-formed packages in there. One of the advantages to MDS is that it will repackage stuff for you automatically. So if you drop in Microsoft Office and it's a distribution type package that macOS installer likes, that's great. It'll just use it. If you drop in something else, like maybe an older version of Office or a package that is just a straight raw package, it'll recognize that and say, hey, I'm going to repackage that for you and then install it correctly. You can even drop an app into it. You can grab Chrome from the applications folder and drop it in this folder. MDS will say like, hey, this is an app. I am going to wrap an installer around it and then install that with the macOS installer. So if you've been using the macOS installer to kind of deploy, this does a lot of things for you. For the scripts, the same thing. If you have a script, it'll actually put into a package and run that script. Any of the environmental variables that you set and prompt the user for will get passed to your scripts. So you might prompt the technician that's setting up for the subnet that the machine's on or the building that it's in, and that information will get passed to your script, and then you can do things on it when it's in installation. And for profiles, you can install profiles as well. This is usually just for a root certificate that's trusted and maybe enroll in MDM. You can create user accounts. So these can either be admin or non-admin user accounts, provide a password, have they hidden. And I also added in SSH keys because we have people using MDS for build servers that they want to be able to SSH into. And so it makes a really nice way to set up user accounts. So we started with 1 user and we added it in, so you now can create as many users you want. For options, Wi-Fi is an important one. We can have it join Wi-Fi either when you first start running the workflows to verify that you have Wi-Fi so you get all the firmware updates, or and I guess both, is you can join Wi-Fi afterwards. So it will actually use the command line utility to join Wi-Fi with the SSID and the password. The computer name is important. We support variable substitution, so you can use the serial number, you can prompt for it, you can use other attributes to set the computer name, and then various other options, including skipping the setup assistant. We do leave the ability to skip the setup assistant, but enable location services. So it'll set the clock correctly, because if the time zone is wrong, the clock will be wrong. So you can do a lot of different pieces. There's a install MicroReport option as well, and that option allows you to, if you're running MicroReport already on the MDS server itself, it'll actually set it up so the client gets enrolled into MicroReport. And of course, we have Monkey to be able to install it. If you already have Monkey running on this MDS server and you click configure client, it'll automatically pull the URL for that server. If you have it hosted somewhere else because you're hosting it on a web server externally, it'll be able to, you just put the URL in there and it works fine. Variables are really, I mentioned variables a couple times. Variables allow you to prompt the technician for things. Like if you ask them like what building they're in, because maybe you want to do a web call to enroll the serial numbers in your script. You put in something like, what building is this Mac going to be installed? And so it'll, when they run the workflow, they'll get an option. And it'll ask them a question and they'll answer it. And that response will be passed to all scripts as an environment variable called MDS var2. So you would just use that in whatever way you want to. And we added in some additional types. So we can not just have free-form text, but you also have specific choices and an other option. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in prompting the technician beforehand. And as I mentioned before, there's the ability to create the Arduino automaton that is built into MDS. So if you bought one from Adafruit, you can just plug it in and create it, or you can buy one from us that's already configured. And then once you go and actually set it up, you put in the command that's run, any kind of pieces that you need. We added in the ability to do firmware. So if you have the same firmware password for all Macs, then you can use that to automatically type it in. So you hold down the Option key, instead of it showing the boot selector, it shows the firmware password. Just plug in the automaton and it goes to town. We added a bunch of other features as well. Two I want to highlight. One is you can create the macOS installer on external volume, and that's great for if you have older Macs that don't require you to enable booting from external drive, and you don't have a recovery partition. So you create the macOS installer. All this does is it runs the create media, external media, or whatever it is from the macOS installer to allow you to have it, and then you can save the workflows on that same drive. And so you basically have an external drive that you can boot from and run the workflows on. So it works really well. We also have a new feature, Download macOS, that's based on Greg Nagel's install macOS, which is something that allows you to create a macOS installer. We basically put a UI around it. So that's been really helpful for folks. So a big aspect of this is that of MDS, it doesn't require you to change any security settings. When you don't have to go into recovery and disable any, don't have to use CSR util disable SIP, you don't have to enable external booting. It basically allows you to use it just from the recovery. And you don't have to use the MDM that's built into MDS. It works fine for using it with an existing MDM. So if you already have Jamf or Mosel, it'll work fine with that. And if you're enrolled in DEP, you can use that with the built-in MDM, or you can use it with any other MDM that your DEP configuration sends down. Last thing I want to highlight is that we do have syncing. So if you create workflows and you have the ability to share those workflows out. So you do what's called create a master image. And so you save that to a web server, and then anybody that's running MDS can synchronize to that disk image on the web server. And they'll get them down, and they'll be read-only workflows, and so they can modify them for their own purposes or just use them. So you can have like an approved workflow for your organizations or multiple ones, and then they can base their own workflows off of that. We do have package management, so we have a UI for making sure Monkey and Monkey Report and MicroMDM are installed, as well as if there are any updates available. You can see here that older version of Monkey, and I need to upgrade to a later one. Monkey Report is a great integration. Monkey Report requires PHP as well as some configuration file twiddling. We made that really super easy with MDS. You just basically import the files from the zip you download from the repository, and it sets everything up for you. And MDM, we kind of brought the functionality, the required functionality for MicroMDM and made it available through the UI. The MDM service has to keep running on the Mac Mini or whatever Mac you have that's running it. So it's important to have that running and on and available. But if that's true, it'll work great. MDS is open source as an MIT style license, so you can take it and use it for your own things. You don't have to pay a fee for each client, so you can deploy it as far and wide as you want to. There is paid support, so Two Kudos does offer support, so if you want to do that. And we also sell hardware, but the hardware is open source as well as the firmware, so you can download and modify it. But if you wanted to buy it from us, you get a nice little enclosure and a USB cable. All right, so some of the resources that we have, we go to twocanoes.com/ it's actually, if there's a vanity URL, twocanoes.com/MDS. We'll get there. We have an active Slack community it's actually twocanoes-MDS now. I'm gonna update this slide. And we focused on a lot of documentation and YouTube videos. I'm actually up to 171 videos now, not just on MDS, but a lot of them are. And so I've been posting as many as possible, and folks like going through and be able to do that. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I will stop here for any questions because it's 12:27. So let me share my screen. Rusty, yes. I will hand it over to you for some Q&A.
All right, very good. So we've got a couple Q&As in here, and I'm going to try and start from the top. And I think this is a two-part question. So we've got Anonymous asking or presenting the case. MDS installer for 10.15.4 is failing on 16-inch Macs. This may just be just a warning for you. I'm using the app installer. I don't get any error. It basically finishes the installer workflow, restarts the Macs, and I see it goes to network recovery after that.
Okay. So, if it goes to that's new. I have seen this issue. I think it was mentioned in Slack, and I haven't really had a chance to get to it. But if it does go to internet recovery, most likely that means it requires network access when you use the macOS installer. It requires network access to be able to do the firmware updates. If it's a brand new Mac that's never had gone through the setup assistant, it does what's called personalization, and T2 Macs will do this. And if it doesn't have that, it'll boot back into recovery. You just select the startup disk and it'll personalize it and be able to do that. And so this will happen if you don't keep the internet connection, or it's not available to get to Apple servers when you go all the way through MDS. So if you were to unplug it at the beginning, it'll still work, but then it'll prompt you to go back into recovery and bless that APFS volume to what's called personalization. So that's most likely what's happening there.
Okay, great. Another question: can you use MDS as a standalone repackager?
Yes-ish. So I thought that when I wrote the repackager, I thought this would be great as a library. So I said I made a second open source project called Repackage. That's a Mac OS app. You can just drag packages or scripts or apps onto it, and it'll repackage them for you. That being said, if you were to save the workflow, you could go in there and grab the packages out if you want to, but I'd recommend using a repackage tool, and that's on Bitbucket. And if you ask me later on in the PSU MacAdmins Slack channel, I'll give you a link to that.
Great. Let's see. When repackaging apps, how are ownership permissions assigned, and can they be modified?
Right. So I didn't want to get into the internals of what it doesn't repackage them in the sense that it doesn't pull all the resources out and put stuff together. What it does is it takes the package that's not well formed, like it's not a distribution type, puts it in a folder, and then makes a distribution package around it with a post install script to deploy it later on. So it basically takes your package, installs it in /temp, then runs the installer command on it to install it. So it doesn't change anything from the original package. It just makes it into a distribution package and installs it later, like if you're doing it after the macOS install, or if you have a really badly formed package, it has to run in user space, it can do it as a first login. And so we've seen that with like the really old versions of Office. We're required to like stuff to be happening in the dock. It'll do it that way. So in terms of answer your question for permissions, I don't change anything on the initial one. So you'd have to change on the initial package before you do it.
Great.
Okay.
Will this work with Jamf Pro? We have never used Monkey.
Monkey, so yes, it works great with Jamf Pro. A lot of people are using it with Jamf Pro. It supports DEP as well as enrolling in Jamf, either through DEP or through a profile. And you don't have to use the MDM built-in or Monkey. There is people that are using, so Jamf Pro has inventory, it has package management, it has MDM, right? So if you can mix and match if you wanted to. So you could use the MDM functionality of Jamf Pro, then use Monkey for package management. One of the nice things about Monkey, it has a software portal, so users can go in and update it. I know Jamf has that, but this one is a lot more customizable, I guess, than the one that Jamf has. So you can mix and match if you want to.
Great. Hey, Tim, nice product. Can you also remove config profiles in a single user mode? Something we have as a machine sometimes not connecting to Jamf anymore, and we have to do a lot of steps in single user mode in recovery. And it should be nice. It would be nice to automate this.
So we have scripts that allow you to run with workflow. So the idea is that you could actually not install the OS and just have a workflow that runs a script. So you could have them kick off that script, and all that workflow would do is just run a script that would remove that profile. So your specific thing about removing a profile in recovery or single user mode, if you already know how to script that, we can automate it, and we can probably figure out how to script it. Maybe, I don't know. Apple's gotten very, like the whole process for enrolling MDM has become very user intensive. Let's just say, or DEP.
Yeah,
it's stratifying.
Okay. If I want to start from scratch with a new client, can MDS serve all my needs, including setting up MDM?
That depends on what your needs are, right? So it's a great way to get started, especially if you want to be able to be introduced to these open source projects. Really easy way to deploy them initially. It scales up. I feel comfortable scaling up to a couple hundred clients running on a modern Mac Mini But in terms of like, will it meet the requirements of, you know, a full-on MDM, like with iOS devices and being able to do all the things Jamf Pro? No, it's not a replacement for that. It's not meant to be, but it's a great starting point to be able to use those if you don't need all the advanced features of Jamf Pro or a full-on MDM. So okay. Maybe. So there's a definitive maybe for you.
Perfect. Is that Zoot on your shelf?
It is. My brother worked on the Henson lot, not for Henson, but for another one, but they do space, and he knew the guy that would do the little animatronics. So it's actually Zoot. He got this for me. Zoot. And it's numbered. So it's 449 of 5,000. I love Zoot. And it's here because my son was young when I got it, so I brought it in the office, so he can't break it.
Excellent.
That's an Altair, by the way, too, flashing there, just in case anybody wonders. Very proud of it.
Very nice. Just a comment, outstanding. My first exposure to this and the presentation was amazing. I can't wait to get into this.
All right.
Another one, we had a machine that had an EFI firmware password secure boot and was enabled, and the admin user to enable File Vault was not working anymore. Can you use your tool to run only the terminal? That was
right. So that was oh, keep going.
No, go ahead.
That was possible in 10.14 and 10.15 if your File Vault it was enabled. You do have to put an admin password in, which means you have to reset it, which means you go up and do reset, and then you have to wipe it. You go to basically the flashing question mark, boot into Internet Recovery, and then you can run the workflow. So no, our tool can't do it from as easy it could in 10.14, but that's unfortunately a limitation that Apple put on Internet Recovery. And I've had escalated this with Apple, and they're basically the idea that comes back is that they want to destroy all the data. If it's lost and it's File Vault, they want to remove it, not leave a recovery partition, not allow you to get access to anything. So it's very much a conscious decision to make sure that you are back. Nobody can get access to any of your data. Oh, you're still muted, Rusty.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to have one more question here, and then we're going to wrap this up. And I'm going to try and pick a good one here. Would you feel comfortable have a user use this remotely just to erase and install workflow?
Oh, yes. So the idea, we have people doing this where they send out basically a thumb drive or mount it on a disk image and have them access it and run the workflow. And so that's one of the key advantages for MDS is having non-technical people or people that don't need to be trained on this, right? Basically a few simple steps to run through it. So we have folks that are in like, when they send out a new Mac, the office manager, the person who receives it, normally doesn't deal with technology, but they know to set up this machine and plug in the automaton, it connects back and be able to do it. So yeah, very, very comfortable doing that. In terms of like, I thought it was a question about MDM, but this is more about running the workflows. Yeah, in terms of technical ability, once they get the workflow up and running, it's pretty much automated.
All right, fantastic.
I'm going to head over to the PSU MacAdmins Slack channel, and if there are any more questions, I'll be glad to answer that. Plus, we have our own Tukanews-MDS channel too you can jump into, so please join.
All right, fantastic. That's at the Slack channel on the macadmins.org Slack. So, Tim, thank you very much for taking your time to deliver us today's first Campfire session.